Hello, I'm Sean Lim, and welcome to After 10. What makes the good life? For years, countries have measured national happiness through economic measures like GDP growth and national wealth, but the OECD recently has used a different measurement. On tonight's After 10, we explore the Better Life Index measured by the OECD. Stay with us.
경제 부흥과 국민 행복, 문화 융성을 이뤄낼 것입니다. 부강하고 국민 모두가 함께 행복한 대한민국을 만드는데 저의 모든 것을 바치겠습니다.
With the establishment of the new government, President Park Geun-hye proposed national happiness as an ultimate goal of her administration. Now is the time when countries around the world are promoting policies to improve the quality of people's lives and their happiness levels. Using new ways to analyze data, the OECD announced a new system that measures the life satisfaction of people from its member countries. The annual OECD Better Life Index proposes a new definition of an advanced nation and a new standard of happiness. The person who created the OECD Better Life Index visited Korea this week. He is Anthony Gooch, Director of Public Affairs and Communications at the OECD. Meet Anthony Gooch and hear more about the real significance of life satisfaction and happiness. Well, Mr. Gooch, thank you so much for joining us tonight on After 10.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
So your role at the OECD is to simplify the many complex programs, initiatives, data that the organization has and communicate it out to the general public, I believe.
It is. It's a challenging task, but at the same time, it's a very exciting proposition because when I joined this organization a little over 5 years ago, I thought it was a mine of valuable elements and information, but there was a real job to actually get it out there and get it to speak to normal people. And we began that process in earnest in 2008, just at the time that the biggest crisis in the history of OECD started hitting. And so the importance of showing the relevance of what the OECD does for normal people, everyday people, voters, taxpayers, citizens, suddenly went from being something that was a good idea to being necessary. Why is it that organizations like the OECD exist? Why are countries members of them? Why is Korea a member? Why do countries pay money, taxpayers' money, to fund what we do? What is our value? And that's very much at the center of what we have to do every day. Justify our existence, but also hopefully in doing that, we are bettering the lives of citizens in the countries that are members of OECD and around the world.
Well, one of the treasures from this trove is this Better Life Index that was born almost 3 years ago. What was the impetus behind that?
And in 2011, our job, my job, was to really try and explain and show why it is that the OECD is as relevant today as it was 50 years ago. If it didn't exist, we'd have to invent it, and why it should be around for another 50 years. That's a selfish element, when you work for an organization, to explain that. It was also a moment, as I said, we were in the midst of the biggest crisis since the organization was created. And at that time, already before the crisis hit, we felt that there was a very latent, strong desire on the part of citizens all around the world to find answers to an existential question, which is, what is life about? What is well-being and quality of life? What's important to us as human beings, as people? Because that's why the OECD exists. That's what we're about, actually trying to improve people's lives, developing the highest standards in public policy in order to do this. But do we have an answer to the question? And a lot of this gravitated around what you said in your introduction, which is that traditionally we have fallen into the trap of using classic and narrow economic measures, and that those measures have effectively become the sort of standards by which we ranked ourselves as countries. You know, is this a good country? Why? Because its level of GDP is higher than another one. So does that make it better than that other one? From certain perspectives and certain measures, yes. But what is most important in life? Is it income? Is it your job? Is it your housing? Material elements of well-being? What about your health? What about your sense of happiness? What about the degree to which you have a healthy environment around you? How educated are you? All of these elements, when we think about our lives on a daily basis, they are very important. Our families, our friends, how safe we feel as well. All of these, when you actually sit down and think through it, you go, oh yeah. But do we capture that? Do we measure that? Have we actually ever produced anything that allows you to look at life in that holistic way? Because GDP doesn't capture that.
So this index has 11 areas that hope to move beyond the question of, or move beyond the statement that wealth and GDP is everything. How does it capture in 11 areas like these existential questions, as you said?
The first thing that we do is not pretend that we know the answer. So the OECD is often thought of as an all-seeing and all-knowing organization. Very recently, as you know, we issued the OECD PISA report, which measures the levels of secondary education all around the world. We now have 70 countries involved in this. In Korea, I'm sure you focused on it heavily, and I hope you focused on it heavily, because you do very well.
In math and science, people were very happy with
knowing the
figures.
propensity of people to look critically at themselves, I'm sure also that you would have been looking at certain elements, for example, the stress factors, the degree to which in Korea there's a higher level of stress maybe than there is in countries like Finland that also traditionally do pretty well. That's a more classic way for the OECD to go about things, which is to produce data, comparable data, and then for your purposes, give a ranking that you are then able to say, okay, well, Korea does better than country X or worse than country Y. In this case, we do not purport to have the answer today.
So there's no number one in this index?
The number one, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So the number one depends on what you consider to be most important in life. Yes, it's true, we have reduced this down to 11 dimensions. There are certain dimensions that we have not incorporated in the index that I personally consider to be really important to my life. So we don't pretend, if you like, that what we have come up with is the last word in this. If anything, historians may look back on this period and say, these were the baby steps that we took to try and capture what really constitutes well-being and quality of life. But it's a start. And being able to do it on the basis of what we at the OECD have been measuring in some cases for 50 years. So part of it was also to draw on what we could draw. No other international organization could produce this index because no other international organization measures all of these elements of well-being across the board and has been doing so for as long as we have. There are a couple of areas where the measures are not traditional OECD measures and where we are getting data from organizations that are not in the governmental realm. For example, on life satisfaction, which is, if you like, the closest that we come to happiness within the index. This is not a happiness index. It's an index of quality of life, of which your sense of happiness is a constituent part. I love soccer. At a weekend, if my soccer team wins, I'm happy. If they lose, I'm sad. But does my quality of life collapse because my soccer team has lost? If I am reasonably mentally stable, no. Some of us who love our football teams a little bit too much, until they've won again, yes, everything stops. But it's a way of conveying the fact that happiness can have an ephemeral quality. Quality of life, well-being is more imagining if you like, a structure like a temple where you have 11 pillars. And all of those pillars, 11 or 12, they constitute together a degree of quality of life and well-being. And what we're trying to do is, first off, ask people the question, do you agree that we need to move beyond material measures?
And as an organization, you moved in that direction. Many people, when they look at the OECD, understand the OECD, they think of it as a very valuable resource for quantitative analysis, but you're moving into areas that sociologists, psychologists, even philosophers tend to struggle with. Was that a easy transition or something that you think was already inherent in what you do?
I think it's the latter. when you hit 50, the other thing you do is you look back. When the organization was set up back in 1961, one of the fundamental purposes was to improve the economic and social well-being of people all around the world, whether they were citizens of OECD countries or in other parts of the world. So it's a very open organization from the inception. Economic and social well-being, that's at our origin. But it isn't all about pure economics. Equally, if you dissociate the economic from other elements, how relevant are the other elements? So it's actually an exercise in trying to marry elements together. The economics of anything are important. They're also very powerful, often in convincing people who may be very reticent about issues, for example, from a moral perspective, to open their minds. I'll give you an example. There are countries around the world where women are far more integrated in the workforce than other countries. Some people may consider the integration of women into the workforce to be a moral imperative, a necessity, something that should be the case. There shouldn't be any need for anything else. Others, we may struggle actually to find that resonates in certain places. If you bring to bear economic arguments to say there are economic reasons why bringing women into the workforce makes sense, then you can make the minds of those who may be less open look at things in a different way. So the OECD certainly isn't rejecting the E in its title as economic, but that E is as much education, environment, energy, as it is pure economic.
So it seems as if we're at a new phase of the life cycle of our hierarchy of needs. Now that we may have had our material needs met, we're looking for something beyond. Well-being is a term that is used a lot here in Korea, and it has now a bit of a Korean flavor to that definition. But this study's been out for over 2 years. What do you think the term well-being means for a lot of the members of the OECD or the people who are interested in this report?
I think what people are fundamentally in agreement with is that when they look at what's important in their lives, and if you see well-being as that, my well-being is the elements that constitute a good life for me. What makes those up? There is a broad agreement around the world. We have now had 7 million visits to our index. Our index is a website. Any one of your viewers tonight can go online, can carry out the index. I invite them to do it and share those results with us, because they then allow us to be able to say what I'm saying tonight, which is that across the board of those 11 dimensions, we have had a lot of people essentially voting to say that each one of those 11 dimensions is important. After 2.5 years of existence, we have started to get a lot of indexes shared with us as an organization. That allows us to tell the story of what people are thinking as a result. And what's coming out on top? Life satisfaction, so that sense of happiness is very important. Health, education, work-life balance. At a global level, these issues are the top 4 of the 11 issues. Income is coming in around 9th place, housing around 7th or 8th place, and jobs as well. So there's a recognition that those elements are important, but what we're seeing is that the more quality of life elements relative to the material are considered as, if not more important. Therefore, the fundamental premise, which was we do need to go beyond GDP, what we're hearing from people is, yes, we want to go beyond GDP. And this is something that is allowing us to start doing that. It doesn't mean that everybody thinks the same. If you take a country like Korea, in the case of Korea, the top and the bottom are exactly the same as at a global level. So life satisfaction is coming out on top. That sense of happiness, people feel that is an important element. But in Korea, the sense of safety is second highest. Around the world, that's coming out 5th or 6th. And that, in a certain sense, may be logical. People in Korea, they also live in a particular environment. There's a near neighbor to the north where there are sometimes issues of insecurity that are felt. A near neighbor of Korea is Japan. also has safety very high up. Right now, people in Japan feel that that's their number one concern when they're thinking of well-being. Well, it's only a short time ago, unfortunately, that they had a major tsunami and nuclear accident, and that has really left a scar in people's minds. So when you look at these things, or you look at countries, for example, that are suffering very heavily from unemployment, the issue of jobs goes up the agenda. So this is a very, very important initiative, as much as anything, for us to be in listening mode. Whether it's the OECD, whether it's corporations, governments, media organizations, we actually need to have our ears open, our eyes open to what it is that is important for people, not assume that we know that. And then the trick is to actually be able to use those elements to do our job in the future. Not assume that, well, if we get those GDP numbers up or if we get employment numbers up, that's it, job done.
Well, part of your job seems to be creating, like you say on your literature, better policies for better lives. So how does this index inform policymakers?
In the first stage, what you're also doing is you are connecting in with policymakers, because policymakers are making policy for who? For people. So if you're a policymaker, at some point probably someone has chosen you. They may well have chosen you, and you are lying in government. You're a minister. You're a prime minister. You're a president. You make policy. You design policy. But you may not be alone in that ultimate product, because you may need a parliament or a legislature in order to approve a policy that you are putting forward. They may even amend it. Then you're a legislator, a politician. You're also looking to be elected. So you're going to have an ear to what people are actually saying to you. From our perspective as the OECD, our ultimate mission is to develop the highest standards in public policy in order to improve the lives of people. The people who pay taxes, the citizens, the people who vote in our democracies. And we have to know what it is that they want. Any company spends its entire time doing this. What do my consumers want? I'm a company that produces goods for people. Well, what is good in their eyes? And in that same way, it's incumbent on us to make that effort vis-a-vis the people who we ultimately work for. So policymakers are informed by this, first off, by capturing the fact that there is a complexity to well-being. We cannot reduce it down to some relatively simple and convenient numbers. GDP measures were never designed to be measures of well-being. We were very instrumental in the creation of GDP as a measure, the OECD. We published GDP figures on a very regular basis. And so we felt that it was a responsibility of ours, if you like, because by default, these measures had somehow become equated with well-being measures, that it was up to us, we had the wherewithal to do it, to produce an instrument that people can play. What music are they playing to us? We have to listen to that music, because we also have to be able to adjust and be able to show people, okay, if there are elements in your life that are really important, for example, work-life balance, what can we do as policymakers and designers of policy to improve work-life balance for people? That requires action, specific action. It requires best practice. It requires looking around the world at what works. It also requires looking at what constitutes growth and reward. I'll give you a very basic example. In my own world, for the first time this year at the OECD, I have a team of 160 people who report to me. I was able to give them a choice between being rewarded, the really good performers, being rewarded with more money or more time. Time has value. If you want to spend that time with more holiday, with more free time, with your family, with your friends, you may not want more money, but something that's really valuable to you is time. And if I'm only able to offer you the money and you can't get the time, maybe you will go somewhere else where you can get more time and less money.
What was the most interesting thing to come out of the data about Korea?
On Korea, I think obviously that is a little bit dependent on your vantage point, but I found personally interesting the fact that at both ends of the spectrum you have a similarity in the case of Korea and global averages. There's more balance across the board in terms of the collective choices that Koreans make. So there's less of a gap, if you like, between life satisfaction at the top and civic engagement at the bottom. In our averages, civic engagement is not given a lot of importance in many countries in the world. And in the case of Korea, there's a greater balance between the 11 dimensions, which I think is a positive element. Material living conditions a little bit higher in Korea. The safety issue that I mentioned earlier on, I think that's important because there are country specificities. We're not all in the same exact situation. Equally, there are parallels to be drawn between countries that may lie in the southern hemisphere, in a sunny climate, and countries that may lie in the northern hemisphere, in a European context, in a Nordic context. And people will say, well, what the hell do Korea and Finland have in common? They're so different, aren't they? And yet you look at education, and Korea and Finland have a hell of a lot in common. And they've probably benefited from each other's experiences. In fact, I was just reading this morning about how there's going to be even greater connection between those two countries. There's an interest in Korea about how perhaps you can get the students to be a little bit more relaxed and have a bit more fun, whilst retaining those really high levels of performance.
So the Korean government is trying to really push its future development of its economy towards a creative economy. How do you think that this index, or do you see that, are you hopeful about that direction based on what you found from this index?
I think the index itself is an example of creativity. Human beings have creativity in their genes in all sorts of walks of life. The Korean people have a great tradition of creativity as well, in different domains, whether that's in the musical field. You still have one of the global stars in recent times who most children around the world seem fascinated by. So from our perspective, we think that initiatives like this, they're in keeping with an innovative society, a society that wants to push boundaries. We've always done this as human beings. If we look back to other times in our history, there were certain things that we didn't realize, that we didn't really latch onto. And so we're always evolving. Hopefully we're improving at the same time. And so I think if one is committed to developing an innovative society, a creative society, the sorts of findings that you're getting certainly take you in a direction like that. How do you capture, for example, creativity and innovation in the case of well-being? I think that's an interesting question that we must pose ourselves. And perhaps in the case of Korea, we will get input to say, well done, OECD. We like this first attempt on capturing well-being. But for example, one of the great innovative spaces and creative spaces is associated with culture, whether that is in the musical field, in film, in theatre, in the media, you name it, it lies in that space, in sport as well. I think it's incumbent on us at a certain point to see how we can capture that. The thing is that we traditionally have not measured that at the OECD.
Well, I'm sure you'll be able to find some new metrics and bring us even greater reports in the future. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And that does it for us tonight on After 10. We'll see you again next time. Goodbye.